Welcome back, everyone. It's Michael with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to talk about the best international offshore banks of 2020. All right. Click the subscribe button, like this video if you like it, actually. If you don't, just write in the comments, tell us what's going on. Anyway, we're going to talk today about the 2020 best banks. And this is there's a couple different parts to this subject, because on the one hand, I would say, normally we're looking just at bank quality, and sometimes we're looking at specific needs of banks. But today, we're in 2020, and what 2020 means, which is different than all the previous years that I might have, discussed this topic with people, is the possibility to travel is greatly diminished, okay? So whereas you might have said, okay, great, I can use XYZ Bank in Hong Kong or UAE or something before, that may not be an option for you today, because you just may not be able to travel there. And if you have to travel to open an account, that's a problem. So today we're going to be talking a lot about remote banks. I'm going to go through a few different things with you. I'm going to talk about possibly best places to have a brokerage account. I'm going to talk potentially about best private banks. I'm going to talk to you about best banks for remote opening. And I'm going to talk about the subject of best banks for something like crypto, okay? So let's dive into that. Let's start with the idea of the best places to go for remote. And we're going to talk about two different sides to this equation, because as I try and tell people quite often, the best places, the places that you can bank and the places that you want to bank may be two very different places, all right? And we've talked before about how there's a significant difference between being kind of mid-shore, right, and being totally offshore. So I have people to this day who come to me talking about opening up companies in BVI and all kinds of this thing. And the reality is that your banking options are so low that we pretty much throw that out. So what we're looking at here is kind of like the most offshore type places would be Hong Kong and UAE probably. Okay, so we're talking about Hong Kong, UAE, European countries, the US, whatever, places like this. UK LLPs, Canadian LPs, Canadian LLPs, all that kind of stuff, right? So for these types of businesses, what are the best places to bank? And I'm going to give two different options that are, I think, quite interesting. So the first one is looking at BNP Paribas, or Paribas, however you pronounce it, right, is a pretty compelling option right now. Why? Well, first of all, because it's actually a tier one bank, right? It's a good, large quality international bank that you can feel quite confident in being backed by its brand and the people who bank there, et cetera, okay? Second of all, you can bank there with non-resident companies that are pretty, from places like Hong Kong, from places like UAE. Now, it's not necessarily easy to do these things, okay? You need to put together a story, you need to have the connection and things like this, but it is possible, right? So very, very good, right? And number three, we now have the ability right now, due to kind of the Corona situation, to open remotely. So very, very interesting option. Okay, so that's kind of one of the first ones that I think is very interesting. The second one is Standard Chartered. Okay, Standard Chartered, again, very large international bank. Although it's a UK bank, it's primarily large in Asia. Once again, you can open for companies in places like UAE, in places like Hong Kong, etc. They're quite open to a broad range of countries. And that's pretty attractive, and the account opening is not too difficult. Now, what I've noticed in the case of companies like that is they do typically need history, all right? So you can't typically form a new company and open there. This is a modern trend that we've seen a lot in Hong Kong, we've seen a lot in a few different places, but what you can do is you can at least open with a company that has a year or two of history. So this may beg you the question, well, hang on, how am I gonna get that history? I would say typically kind of the go-to strategies are to start with companies like TransferWise. TransferWise, although it's what I would call a small business bank or an individual bank, meaning that you can't run tens of millions of dollars through TransferWise typically, although that is the case, you tend to be in a situation where it's pretty easy to open accounts for most people in most parts of the world, and you can build up some history, so that's great. Also, in the case of when we're talking about Hong Kong, you can use companies like Neat are an option. And then there's a whole bunch of EMIs. Okay, so we'll get into that a little bit more when we start talking about places that you may want to bank for crypto, etc. All right, so that's, we're talking about major kind of tier banks, etc. Now let's talk about brokerage accounts. When it comes to brokerage accounts, I would typically say that Interactive Brokers is the go-to choice. Okay, so most of the time when somebody reaches out to us, they may have some specific requirements. They may say, oh, I don't want to be here, I don't want to be there, etc. So it's not always you have, but Interactive Brokers is pretty much the go-to. You get a lot of options there. The fees are very low. It's quite easy to get set up for people from all over the place, and so Interactive Brokers tends to be the go-to. And typically, what you're going to find when you look at, for instance, TBC in Georgia, if you go to Galton Taggart, which is their trading company for managing the ability to invest in stocks, etc., they simply white label Interactive Brokers. Okay, so you're still using IB's platform. If you go to Bank of Georgia, they're using Saxo Bank's platform. So there are some other ones, depending on where people want to be. We sometimes put them in some Swiss options, etc. So banks in Switzerland, but these are typical go-to places. From there, we're going to move on to the subject of best places that I would typically recommend for somebody in wealth management. Okay, you're saying, hey, listen, where do I want to be from a wealth management standpoint? Okay, and this is if you're saying we're not talking about transactional banking, right? So we're not talking about a lot of, certainly it's not a commercial, hey, I'm paying my employees and receiving payments from my vendors and things like this. You may have a corporate account, but it's typically an investment entity, right? So not a lot of transactions, but very high quality banking, very safe banking, etc. We would typically look at Safra Bank or Julius Baer, both in Switzerland. Okay, so very major international banks that are quite attractive. What's next? We can go from there to shifting over and looking at what we're talking about for, say, crypto banking. Now, crypto banking, kind of the go-to, if it's an option that people always talk about, is Silvergate Bank, which is, I believe, California-based. And so where possible, that's an option. So this is a little bit more of a tricky situation because it does depend on where you are. It depends on what type of business you need to do in terms of currencies, etc. So that's, if you're talking about US dollars, but if you start talking about euros, things like this, are we talking about storing a lot of money there, or are we talking about just flowing money through there? So some different places that you can potentially go. If you're very large, you could look at Deltec Bank in Bahamas, but usually that doesn't come into the equation. Sometimes you can say, okay, great. In fact, for most of the time, if you're European based, we're going to look at, there's some particular EMIs that would be the go-to. And so this is what you'll find pretty much is that the Lithuanian central bank is probably most friendly to crypto at this point in time within Europe, from what I've seen. And so for people who want to run crypto exchanges, who want to act as crypto brokers, etc., this is the case. Now, what you're going to find is that the fees are probably going to be quite high, but that's another way to go. There is a bank in Switzerland that's fairly friendly, and then there's some options in South Pacific. Or the other one that I wouldn't say is so great if you're wanting to operate an actual crypto business, but if you're simply doing a normal business account and you're engaging with crypto, would be UOB from Singapore. Okay, so that's pretty much what I would say are the top line banks to consider right now. Obviously, if we're in a situation where we're saying, okay, there's a specific need, for instance, you're forming a US LLC, then, what are your options? Well, can you travel to the US? This is different. If you can travel to the US, then it's again going to depend on what it is that you're looking at. So here we very often work with Bank of America. We very often will work with banks such as Chase, such as Wells Fargo. I tend not to like as much, but they're potentially an option. And Citi. Typically, I would say Citi and Bank of America tend to be the top two. However, there are some nuances around this where if you're in the e-commerce space, you may want to consider Chase Bank. And the reason for this is as a foreigner, okay, so not as a local. So Chase, I have found, tends to shut down accounts more easily if you're doing a lot of international transactions, and it's kind of it's not very clear to them what the business model is. The reason why we tend to like Chase is for being able to get Chase Payment Tech. Okay, so this is their payment processing division, And so normally what's happening is, often in the case of an e-commerce business, you're setting up in the US in order to access US e-commerce platforms such as Stripe and PayPal. And there is a risk that these may get shut down. Now the problem with that is your options for payment processors, once that happens, are very limited because most of them tend to require a social security number. Okay, so most US payment processors and foreign payment processors won't work with US companies. So you have this kind of back and forth situation that's not good. So here's what you can do, which is really helpful, is you can basically build up history using something like Stripe, operate with Chase, build up some credit, and then open up a Chase Payment Tech account, and then they're quite easy to work with, and that's going to give you a lot of options. So anyway, I hope that helps. Those are, some of the latest. The truth is that there are many individual use cases, and so sometimes you have a company in a particular place that we need to be able to help you out with, and there's only a limited number of options. Okay, great, we're going to go down that road. Other times we're in a situation where we say, hey, listen, we need to deal with, somebody who can't travel, right? Or maybe some particular business scenario, or whatever it is. And so for all those needs, reach out to us if you want help forming companies, international legal tax planning, asset protection, banking, etc. Click the subscribe button, click the like button, tell us what it is that you want to see. We'd love that, and we're going to see you guys on the next video.